In the previous video, we examined the main schools of military history in World War II as well as the post-war period. In this video, I will be discussing historians' views on military history between 1970 and 2000. I will be splitting the periods up in decades, grouping the more influential historians of each decade together. Additionally, I will be choosing a few main themes to discuss in each decade. A crucial perspective in the 1970s was the anti-Asiatic and anti-Japanese perspective in historical writing. A commonly known story is the relocation of Japanese Canadians, which were, quote, rapidly sunk into obscurity, becoming neglected in history books and buried within the Japanese community. This is a quote from Ken Adachi, a journalist who published an article that highlighted the widespread cruel actions against the Japanese Canadians by the Canadian government. Like Indigenous history over the past few decades, Canada has made an attempt to downplay and forget the emotional abuse and hurtful actions that the Japanese Canadians experienced. Overall, Ken Adachi was able to bring this historical perspective into light among Canadians. In the 1980s, there was significant room for growth and hindsight from historians. Building upon what Ken Adachi introduced in the 1970s, Joy Kagawa's novel was able to humanize the Japanese Canadians' wartime experiences for a wider audience. This historical perspective was told through a young girl's eyes who felt persecution from the Canadian government. The novel gave a strong insight into the traumatizing experience of forced relocation, emphasizing the themes of remembrance and forgetting. J.L. Granestein also had a well-known historical perspective on the persecution of Japanese Canadians after the Second World War. Granestein did not deny that racism was relevant in a large part of the country. However, he argued that the common fear of Japanese invasion had driven many in Canada to behave in extreme ways, and that the RCMP had poor language skills which would have led to more persecution due to not being able to communicate with the members of the Japanese community. This enraged the activists, and many sought to discredit Granestein's character. It is important to recognize with hindsight that this was actually a valuable and credible perspective on what happened with the persecution of the Japanese Canadians. During the 40th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, it seemed as if something changed in regards to remembering World War II. It was not a coincidence that Tim Cook, a Canadian military historian, released his new book at the time titled The Fight for History. Tim Cook's main goal in the book was to contrast World War I and World War II. In this book, he noted that the losses in the Second World War seemed to be considered as less serious by the public than in the First World War. In a large part of his book, Tim Cook discussed the McKenna's film The Valor and the Horror. Cook notes that the McKenna singled out one battle from all the battles of 1944, focusing on the Canadian defeat on Verrières Ridge. Cook made a point to criticize that it was one of the worst defeats that was focused on by the filmmakers, rather than the countless other sacrifices that Canadian soldiers made during the war. All in all, Tim Cook's The Fight for History shows that, although the First and Second World Wars are topics that are widely discussed today, there still remains a lot to be debated.